Okay, then let's continue. So we talked about the basic components of an EEG recording system so far. And one important thing that one has to do. And now we want to talk, namely electrode impedance minimization. And now we want to think more about recording and digitization, and for example, also why this amplification is required. So this is, I think, a fairly instructive figure, and it shows what happens and what needs to be accounted for if one converts an analogous system like electrical potential in a wire into a digital signal, which is of course discrete. And what one has to think about is that there are two discretizing steps. One is of course in time. So here on the x-axis you have time. Let's see. So here on the x-axis you have time, and of course a data point is acquired only at each sampling interval, and we haven't discussed that yet, but we will in a second. There's of course a given sampling frequency, which is for EEG of course a lot higher than for fMRI. So here we measuring a signal essentially every millisecond, where in fMRI we of course only measure every second or so. But there's also a discretization on the y-axis, so the fluctuations of this analog signal, they are not one-to-one mapped into the computer, but the computer allows a given set of values that the signal can take on, and then if the analog signal takes on this value, then we see that. So that's fairly basic and important. This shows what can be done based on different bit resolutions. So now we're talking about the y-axis discretization. So for example, if you're dealing with 2 bits, so if you can represent your analog signal with 2 bits, you can have only 4 different values. And so here you see the analog signal in red, and you can only represent actually values that fall onto these dashed lines. If you have a higher bit resolution, so if you're dealing, for example, with 3 bits, then you can already give a resolution of the analog signal that is of grain 8. Yeah, but this is something one needs to keep in mind when digitizing stuff. Now there is a relation between the analog to digital conversion and high-pass filters. So we will discuss filter in more detail when we talk about EEG preprocessing, but we have to bring it up here at the recording process already. So the notion of a high-pass filter is a filter which lets high frequency pass and filters out low frequencies. And EEG systems, recording systems, embed an online high-pass filter to attenuate the effect of large gradual shifts in voltage. So the problem is if the signal drifts, then over time, so if the signal drifts all the time, and you actually you have such a resolution which is sensitive to certain values only. Now if the signal gets larger and larger and larger because there is some low frequency drift, then you might extend the range of allowed digital representations fairly soon. And hence if a high-pass filter is used, which filters out these low frequency drifts, then amplifier saturation can be minimized. Yeah? So that's a typical recording setup using a high-pass filter. There is also what is known as direct coupled recordings, which does not use a high-pass filter but a high digital resolution, for example 16-bit, to avoid amplifier saturation. And so the question of whether when you record want to use a high-pass filter hardwired into your recording system, or you want to use a direct coupled recording is not something that you have to think about deeply if you do an EEG study, because the EEG systems that you can commercially buy have recommended default recording settings. But so if you, for example, want to do your first EEG experiment and you use the brain ActiCap setup, I always recommend to read the manual, and you will come across these things. Now you know a little bit what they mean, but then also the manual says we recommend that you record with high-pass filter, for example. Yeah. So that was actually the digitization in the y-axis domain. Now we talk about digitization in the x-axis domain, so we're talking about time. And we first introduced some basic nomenclature here. So sampling rate, so there's of course the sampling period, which is the time between two consecutive samples, for example 2 milliseconds, which you of course are very familiar with from the fMRI world. There the sampling period, the time to repetition, so the time between two pulses, two electromagnetic pulses, was called time to repetition, or TR. So you have seen a sampling period before. The only difference here is now that the sampling period is much shorter. The sampling rate is then the number of samples taken per second. It's measured in hertz. That's the number per second. And if you take a measurement every 2 milliseconds, then you can fit 500 samples into 1 second, which corresponds to 500 hertz. Now, one has to, if one deals with the sampling rates, one has to think about what kind of frequencies one can maximally image with such a procedure. So we will talk a little bit more about frequency representations later on. This is a first introduction here, really to talk about frequency representations. We of course would have to talk about Fourier analysis, and I might teach that in the winter term. Again, for the moment, you need to deal with this frequency stuff somewhat on an intuitive level, but that's fine. An important theorem about adjusting sampling rates and knowing what kind of frequency one can observe in the signal is the Nyquist theorem, which says all frequency content of an analog signal can be captured as long as the sampling rate is twice as great as the highest frequency of the signal. Yeah? So if you have the highest frequency of interest, for example, is for example 40 hertz gamma oscillations, then if you're interested in that, then you should sample at least with 80 hertz or more. So the typical sampling rate actually for EEG is 500 hertz. So there you would make sure that you sample all frequencies, so brain frequencies, up to 250 hertz, and really over 100 hertz. I don't think people think that there is some interesting stuff. If you are actually dealing with EEG fMRI recordings, then you might want to go to higher frequencies, because the frequencies induced by the scanner can be higher, and you want to characterize them very well to reduce that. So what's it with this Nyquist theorem? Another expression, another version of it is that that higher frequency content than twice the sampling rate is included in the signal as artifactual low frequency content, and this is referred to as aliasing. So what does this all mean and how can you visualize that? So this is a visualization. And we're looking at the true signals, we're looking at the digital samples, and we look at a signal that is compatible with the samples, yeah, because on the one hand there's the real signal that's happening out there in the world, which might be of arbitrary frequency. Then we digitize that, so we only have discrete samples, and then from our discrete samples we now have to figure out what was actually the original signal. And there problems can come in, and they are essentially addressed and solved if you use it accurately or based on the Nyquist theorem. So what are we talking about? The following. Here you see a true signal, a sine wave, which is of a certain frequency. So you can see that over a given period of time, so let's say the whole thing, it goes through the circle 1, 2, 3, roughly 3.5 times. Now, as you go down here, you see that the signal goes about the circle more times. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or something. So if this is on the x-axis 1 second, then we here have 3.5 hertz, and here we have roughly 10 hertz. Yeah. So the lower, so the signals here, they fluctuate more often over a given time period. Now we think about how we sample that, and here you can see that for all of the different signals, we take a sample here, there, and so on. And you can see so the spacing of the signals, so the digital sampling frequency is the same for all of these signals. Now, if you see that here and you think about what is compatible with that in terms of a sine frequency, then the only sine wave that you can actually fit to these digital samples is the one that was actually the true signal. Now go down here. So here you can see that the samples measure values that are compatible with a relatively low frequency sine. So you can measure so from the digital samples, you get this information that it might be this low frequency sine, could also be a higher frequency, but if you look for a parsimonious explanation, then you would say, okay, it's this low frequency sine. And that's a problem because your signal, so your digital signal, doesn't bijectively tell you what the original signal was. So in this domain where things are fine, the signal frequency is actually smaller than 2 times the sampling rate. At this point, the signal frequency is twice the sampling rate. So you can see that for each walk through the cycle, so starting here and then going once through, you have 2 samples, and these then determine exactly the frequency of the sine wave. And for everything lower here, the signal frequency of interest is actually, so the true signal is larger than twice the sampling rate. And there you can have this problem that you can explain the digital samples with sine waves of a lower or cosine waves of a lower frequency than the one that you actually measured. So this is a very intuitive representation of this Nyquist theorem. Of course, there is a mathematical framework behind all of this, and this can be proven and so on. But we are not going into the details of this in the current course. Though they're very interesting, so maybe in the winter term I teach that again to think about it again. So what can one do about it? So of course one First, it's good to know what kind of frequencies you are interested in. And let's say you're interested in the standard stuff that people are interested in EEG, then you go up to 100 Hertz. That's the maximum frequency you're actually interested in. Then if you have 500 Hertz sampling rate, then you're way above twice the frequency of interest. So everything is fine. One thing that one can do is actually low-pass filter the system, so basically filter out high frequencies and basically get rid of EEG noise that might be of arbitrary high frequency, and to avoid aliasing of high frequency noise as low frequency content. So this would be now some noise in the signal that might be above 200 Hertz. Or 100 or 200 Hertz. To avoid that this shows up in the EEG signal as low frequency content, one can, during recording, use a low pass filter and match that with the sampling rate, meaning that you record in such a way that you say, okay, I don't let any frequency above 200 Hertz into the stuff that I record, because I have a physical low-pass filter, and I use a sampling frequency of more than twice this low-pass filter cutoff, so for example 400, 500 Hertz. So then there's no danger that any high-frequency content aliases to low-frequency noise in the sample. And that's this matching between the sampling rate and a low-pass filter. So the EEG recording systems usually have a low-pass filter system, and then the sampling rate is adjusted such that it's you're on the safe side. For example, 3 times the low-pass filter cutoff frequency. So if you use a sampling rate of 250 Hertz, you want the low-pass filter to be basically have a upper cutoff of 80 Hertz, for example. Again, this is something to know, and know why there are low-pass filter systems in EEG recording setups. It's again not something that you need to worry about when you do your first EEG experiment, because again you can look into the EEG recording setup manual, and it will say, okay, we recommend that there's a low-pass filter of this and this during recording, and you use these sampling frequencies and things are fine. Yeah. Good. So these were these a little bit more nerdy recording and digitization questions. They, in standard doing an EEG experiment, they actually don't come up because the machine is just there and has its default settings, and you don't have to worry about it. But it's good to know about it and know a little bit about the background. With respect to the whole frequency business, we will come back to it. Maybe then also what we discussed here gets a little bit clearer. Again, really to understand the whole frequency business, you have to do Fourier analysis. Now, the last topic then for today are artifacts that are commonly observed in EEG data, and that you need to know and that you need to be able to detect, and then also need to know how to deal with them. This is an interesting statement from the Luck book. He refers to it as Hansen's axiom, and I think it's very important because cognitive neuroscientists love data pre-processing. I think they actually love it a little bit too much, so they should think more about interesting models to explain than the phenomena they found, instead of fiddling with data pre-processing for ages and then knowing a lot of data pre-processing but forgetting how to actually model a neurobiologically informed and statistically informed model actually interesting phenomena. And this statement actually goes into the same direction, and it says exactly what I always try to tell everyone. There is no substitute for good data. It is folly to believe that artifact rejection or any EEG data preprocessing technique is going to transform bad data into good data. It can reject the occasional artifact trials, allowing good data to be better, but there is no way that artifact rejection can compensate for a subject who consistently brings in response to particular events of interest or who emits continuous high amplitude alpha activity. You know, this activity when you're a little bit sleepy. In other words, data that are consistently noisy or have systematic artifacts are not likely to be much improved by artifact rejection. And this is really important because it's really from a practical perspective. Because you can waste a lot of time in life by recording bad data and then doing a first analysis, not seeing like the standard event-related potential, and then having the hope that if you do the pre-processing a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there, it will get better. It will not get better. So I really recommend, if you record EEG data or fMRI data, that you do a basic data analysis. If you see the effects of interest, for example, in event-related potential, or basically that visual cortex lights up in fMRI, you're fine, and you're of course also free to play with the pre-processing a little bit to make things maybe a little bit better. But if you don't see the basic stuff, just realize that and say, okay, the data are not good. Somehow maybe I didn't do the impedances right, or the participant was really sleepy and so on. And don't waste time on reanalyzing and pre-processing the data over and over again with the hope that if you just have the right combination of parameters for the pre-processing, then suddenly it will be great. It won't. So that said, there are artifacts, for example, blinks, and one can correct for them, but they will. These are the whole pre-processing, especially artifact rejection, should, and this is important, should only be cosmetics. Yeah, if your effects of interest really depend strongly on the artifact correction, then these are not very robust effects. So you should try in your experimental work, look for robust effects that are there, that people can reproduce, and that are not completely dependent of whether you do the artifact correction, for example, with a cutoff of 70 or 60 microvolt. Yeah? So artifact rejection, don't have too much hope in it. Know about it, do it, but don't waste time pre-processing data. Develop interesting neurobiological models and cognitive computational models to explain robust EEG effects. Don't waste your life searching for some small EEG effect that might have to do with consciousness or not, because you just stimulated with very little bit of amplitude. Do it if you have the patience. I just don't have the patience and the frustration stamina or something, because it's really not a good experience. So now let's go a little bit more into details. What are the common artifacts that you see? So this shows actually EEG data acquired with a brain vision ActiCap setup when the eyes are open. So here you have the 64 electrodes. Here you see the experimental markers. So there was a stimulus coming up. This is actually checkerboard. So that's the S1 and S11 lesson that you also know from your data. And you see all the electrodes. You see that some electrodes are a little bit more noisy. So for example here, PO10 is a little bit more noisy. Also the O2 seem to be a little bit more noisy. This sometimes because the cap in the back is not really that tight, and then the electrodes are a little bit loose. But it's kind of okay, and there's not much happening. And this is, so this red line is 1 second. So this is EEG data from 1 second. Now, alpha activity, as we discussed, can be induced by the participant just closing their eyes, and you see then this 10 Hertz activity. So if you count the bumps, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's roughly in the 10 Hertz area. And this alpha activity can, of course, mask things of interest. So if all the electrodes have a lot of alpha power because the participant is sleepy, then it's very likely that you don't see any good ERPs. You can induce that by asking the participant to close their eyes, but if you see this during recording when actually the participant is supposed to do their task, you can basically forget this recording session because you will not get any sensible data out of it. This shows muscle activity. So what the participant is doing here is that they grind their teeth, and then you have these muscles that are basically moving your lower jaw, and this lower part of your mouth and mandibula. And these muscles are at the scalp. So if you grind your teeth, you can feel that. And of course, muscle activity is also driven electrically, and this really then obscures many electrodes. You see that it's not that strong in the occipital because these muscles are of course not in the occipital area, but here more in the temporal area. Usually that's not a big problem, so this is something you can do to show your participant what it happens. You should tell the participant to relax and also leave their mouth somewhat open so that you minimize this muscle activity, but it's usually not a big problem because this is only if you only see that if you want it. What's always there are eye blinks. People of course need to blink with their eyes, and for a reason that we will talk about in a second, you can see them in the EEG. They happen of course quite regularly and look somewhat regular, but are of course of biological origin, so somewhat variable. So you see here eye blinks and here eye blinks. You primarily see them in frontal electrodes because that's of course closest to the eyes. So eye blinks are a common thing that one can correct for. One should of course also instruct the participant if they need to blink, and everybody needs to blink of course, they should try to blink not in the time periods where you're actually interested in the signal. So for example, if there's a stimulus coming up, they should concentrate a little bit and try to not to blink during stimulus presentation, and maybe if they give a response, but between trials. And participants can usually do that, especially if they try to help you and give you good data. And then you can still correct for eye blinks, but you have already somehow made sure that these eye blinks don't mask your data of interest. What is this about? This is about the motivation to not only record the EEG and see the eye blinks in the EEG data, but also record some data from the eyes, so to place electrodes around the eyes in a vertical and, for example, also a horizontal manner, and then have an additional measure that which is called the vertical electrooculogram that you can use to detect eye blinks. And the story is here that here you see these fluctuations in FZ and CZ, and here you actually have a blink, which you also record in the VOG. Here you might be tempted to think that this is also a blink here, but then the VOG tells you that this is not a blink. So I have mixed feelings about these electrooculogram recordings. I always feel a little bit bad when I don't record them, but on the other hand, so I've done my way through eye blink corrections, and I found that actually to detect eye blinks, it doesn't make much of a difference whether you detect them on these FP electrodes or you detect them on EUG. So that is maybe about, I don't know, I mean, a rough estimate, but it's something like 2 to 3% might be different, but it's really the rare exception. Yeah. But if you're a little bit more an EEG fundamentalist, then you record the electro-oculogram and use this for EEG, for eye blink artifact correction. Now, where does actually the problem come from? Why do we see these eye blinks? And here the reason is that the eye is actually a dipole, so it has it's more positive on the front side than in the back side, which is due to essentially the anatomy and also the setup of the eye as itself with the retina and everything you know about. So it is a dipole, and the problem is if you close your eyes, your eye moves upward, which is called Bell's phenomenon, and this moves the dipole of the eye with respect to the electrodes that are on the frontal cord, the frontal part of your head, and this then, in this case, yields a positivity in these electrodes. Yeah. So the reason why eye blinks show up on EEG is because the eye itself has a charge. It's a dipole, and the eye moves if you blink. No? Yeah, this shows again typical stuff on EEG. So if eyes are closed, then you see some alpha activity. If you then if people open their eyes, they start to blink, and you see these blink artifacts. Eye blinks are not the only artifact that you can see from the eyes. You can also see lateral eye movements, so saccades, and these usually take this form of step functions or spike potentials. So if the saccade sets on, if you fixate centrally and then move to a different location, this can be detected. And this you actually also see that in the frontal electrodes. So that can either be a feature. So for example, if people respond with the saccades, then it's of course good that you see it, and you might also have eye tracking to see where the saccade is, and then you can bring the eye tracking data and the EEG together and make sure that you don't confuse saccade-induced EEG activity with a real signal. Or it can be noise, and there what you can do is essentially tell people to fixate all the time so that they don't do saccades, and also do eye tracking to make sure that they actually fixate, and then show in your eye tracking data that they didn't do many saccades. Yeah. There's a third type of eye movement, which is this slow roving. This is when you basically follow with your eyes a moving object, and you can also see that. This I think happens mostly when people actually take a break and they look around a little bit or so. So in general, it's not the biggest problem. Yeah, and the lateral eye movements are of course explained the same way as the blink artifacts, namely that the eye is a dipole, and if the dipole moves with respect to the electrodes, then the certain electrodes pick up a larger positivity, and others then a larger negativity. Good. This is a different representation of muscle artifacts, so I don't think there is anything more to say about this. This shows a different representation of alpha activity. Again, here you see the alpha, then you see the eyes open, and then once the eyes are closed again, you again see alpha activity, different representation. Yeah. Good. So we went essentially over data acquisition and artifacts, and I think, yeah, I want to stop here. The next topic then is artifact correction and averaging, and there we will talk about things that you can do against blink artifacts and certain things that you can do for event-related potentials. But yeah, I will leave that for the next session when I'm also not alone and only my cat is listening. But there's a room full of students again. Good, then good night and have a great day. Bye bye.